Hey everyone, and history is so often shaped by the people who hold just immense unchecked power. And today, we are diving into an epic saga of women who quite literally held the fate of entire nations right in their hands. We're going to explore how power can utterly corrupt a person, but more importantly, how an act of ultimate surrender can actually save millions of lives. Our main focus today is an incredible narrative. She was chosen for this moment, the story of Esther. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at tyrants of the throne, faith in the shadows, the orphan becomes queen, the decree of annihilation, a pivotal moment we're calling for such a time, and finally, the golden scepter. Let's get right to it. Section 1. Tyrants of the throne and the corrupting power of the crown. To really grasp the light of our main story, we've got to understand the sheer darkness that preceded it. And we see that perfectly through the ultimate ancient tyrants, Queen Jezebel and her daughter Athaliah. This contrast brilliantly illustrates our core theme for this explainer. It's all about how power is utilized. On one hand, you've got queens like Jezebel and Athaliah, who literally murdered innocent people just to grab vineyards and crowns. They hoarded their power, completely consumed by it. But then, on the flip side, we have women like Rahab and Esther. These women completely surrendered their own comfort and their safety to God's will just to save others. The historical sources detail how Jezebel's absolutely ruthless slaughter of prophets and innocent men ended exactly as it was prophesied. She was thrown from a high window. Boom. Her power evaporated in seconds. And then there's her daughter Athaliah, who was arguably even darker. She actually massacred her own infant grandchildren just to seize the throne of Judah. No way, right? Well, her reign of terror ended in execution when a single hidden baby, Joash, was rightfully crowned. It just goes to show how a crown can quickly become a curse when it's fueled by pure ambition. All right, moving on to Section 2, Faith in the Shadows with Rahab the Canaanite. We are pivoting now from those corrupt, blood-soaked palaces to the doomed, massive walls of ancient Jericho. Because it's here that we find some really unexpected, world-changing faith in a marginalized woman named Rahab. Think about Rahab's situation. She's living in a city that is absolutely terrified of the approaching Israelites. But while her own king is locking the city gates in fear, she takes a massive risk. She hides 2 Israelite spies under the flax on her roof. And in exchange for this, she secures a promise to spare her family's lives. The sign? Just hanging a single, simple, scarlet cord in her window. The absolutely crucial point here is her flawless action in the dark. I mean, she risked her life way before the miracle ever arrived. She boldly misdirected the king's guards and confessed her faith in a God she really only knew through stories. And because she acted on that faith, she survived the total destruction of Jericho. And honestly, remarkably, she eventually became a direct ancestor to the Messiah. Which brings us to Section 3, The Orphan Becomes Queen, detailing Esther's rise. By establishing how seductively corrupting a crown can be and how faith operates in the shadows, we can now truly appreciate our main focus. It's the story of an orphaned girl named Hadassah who was suddenly thrust onto the world stage to become Queen Esther. To really grasp the stakes here, I want you to consider the number 127. King Xerxes ruled 127 provinces. This empire stretched all the way from India to Kush, and he ruled with absolute, terrifying power. Now, after he banished his previous wife, Queen Vashti, simply for defying him, he launched an empire-wide search for a new queen. And he places the royal crown on Esther. But, and this is a big but, on the strict advice of her cousin Mordecai who raised her, Esther kept her Jewish identity a complete and total secret. Here's where things get intense. Section 4, The Decree of Annihilation, brought on by Haman's plot. Evil rarely announces its return with a warning. In the incredibly opulent, politically charged Persian court, it crept in through a deeply arrogant and manipulative official named Haman. This was a guy who demanded absolute worship from every single person around him. The escalation happened incredibly fast. Haman gets promoted, but Mordecai, Esther's cousin, flat out refuses to bow to him. Well, an enraged Haman decides that killing just Mordecai isn't enough. No, he manipulates the distracted King Xerxes using fear and a massive bribe into handing over his royal signet ring. With that ring, Haman signs a terrifying, irreversible law of genocide against all of Mordecai's people. A ticking clock began right then and there. They had exactly 11 months. On the 13th day of the 12th month, every single Jewish man, woman, and child in the empire was ordered to be slaughtered. The decree was sealed. Ashes were thrown into the air across the empire. The shadow of death had officially fallen. Section 5. For such a time, the ultimate crucible of power. This brings us to the absolute breaking point. Trapped behind the massive stone walls of the palace, living in a bubble of complete luxury, Esther was actually initially unaware of the plot. When Mordecai finally got word to her, her perfectly rational fear told her to just stay completely quiet. Because, guys, to go to the king uninvited meant certain death. What is absolutely fascinating here is how Mordecai responds. He totally strips away her illusion of safety. He tells her, look, if you stay silent, deliverance will come from somewhere else, but you will perish. He basically forces her to choose between hoarding her crown, like Jezebel or Athaliah would have done, or fulfilling her divine calling. He asks her the ultimate question. What if you were put in this palace for such a time as this? So, as we mentioned, approaching the inner court uninvited meant instant execution, unless the king happened to extend his golden scepter. So Esther didn't just rush in blindly. Instead, she instructed Mordecai and all the Jews in the city of Susa to fast from food and water for 3 whole days and nights. She was preparing spiritually for an absolutely impossible battle. After those 3 days, she sends this message to Mordecai. If I perish, I perish. Now, I want to be clear. This wasn't a cry of despair or her just giving up. It was an act of ultimate surrender. She fully accepted the cost. And as the source material beautifully highlights, a person who completely surrenders to God's will can no longer be stopped by the fear of men. Which leads us to Section 6, the Golden Scepter, which truly becomes Esther's masterclass. On that 3rd day, radiating calm and unshakable dignity, she dressed in her royal robes. She didn't walk in looking like a beggar. She looked like a queen. And she walked slowly into the inner court, right where the law demanded her execution. Just imagine the tension in that room. The entire court froze in terrifying silence as King Xerxes looked up and locked eyes with her. In that split second, he had to weigh whether to unleash his protocol-driven anger or spare her life. He extended the scepter. But here is Esther's absolute genius. Her patience. When he offered her basically anything she wanted, instead of immediately begging and panicking, she masterfully invited the king and her enemy, Haman, to a series of strategic banquets. She waited for the perfect timing. And wow, while she waited, Haman's pride engineered his own spectacular downfall. Drunk on his own perceived importance between the 2 banquets, Haman goes out and builds a towering 75-foot gallows specifically to hang Mordecai. But he was completely unaware that that very same night, a sleepless King Xerxes would read historical records, realize that Mordecai had actually saved his life in the past, and ironically force a totally humiliated Haman to parade Mordecai through the streets in royal honor the very next morning. You really can't make this stuff up. And that brings us to the 2nd banquet. Esther finally dropped the veil. She revealed her Jewish identity and exposed Haman right then and there as the architect of her people's destruction. The king storms out in a massive rage. Meanwhile, Haman falls onto Esther's couch, begging for his life, which, let's be honest, only seals his fate further when the king walks back in and sees it. In a stroke of swift poetic justice, Haman is executed on the very 75-foot gallows he had just built for Mordecai. This entire narrative is a profound masterclass in divine timing. You know, what is so fascinating about the historical text of Esther is that God's name is not actually mentioned a single time. Not once. Yet, we see how the sleepless night of a king perfectly aligns with the arrogant heart of a villain and the quiet courage of a queen. It really shows us that even when heaven seems silent, invisible hands are constantly working right behind the scenes. So, as we look in the mirror today, the stories of Jezebel, Rahab, and Esther leave us with a pretty heavy question to consider. How are we using the influence, the resources, or the crowns that we've been given? Are we hoarding them for our own safety, or are we willing to step out of our comfort zones and trust perfect timing when the moment calls for ultimate courage? Because perhaps the challenges you are facing right now are not accidents at all. Perhaps you were put exactly where you are for such a time as this.